Welcome to the Treasury Update Podcast, presented by Strategic Treasurer, your source for interesting Treasury news, analysis, and insights in your car, at the gym, or wherever you decide to tune in. On this episode of the Treasury Update Podcast, host Craig Jeffery sits down with Alan Geller, Managing Director of Raines International, for valuable insights on how to best utilize recruiters to position treasurers in organizations for success. Topics of discussion center around effective recruiting methods, the importance of diversity in the workplace, strategies for placement success, and more. Listen in to learn how to maximize your potential in today's work environment.
Alan, thank you for joining me on the Treasury Update Podcast today.
Craig, thank you for having me. I appreciate having a chance to talk to you again.
Alan, I've always viewed you as one of the most successful recruiters in the finance treasury space for many years. And I think it's useful, before we talk about recruiting and team enablement, is to let those directors, ATs, and treasurers hear your wisdom on how to use recruiters or work with recruiters. And maybe before we get into that, you could give us a bit of an overview for those who may not be familiar with Raines International.
So Raines International is a retained executive search firm. We were founded in 1969. Currently, we have 10 offices and about 50 team members. The offices run the gamut from New York City to Chicago, Boston, Austin, Minneapolis, Philadelphia, Miami, and Buenos Aires. And we're doing that. Our mission is to maximize human potential. We have a variety of different disciplines and industrials. I lead the financial officers practice and have a real soft spot in my heart for people who are in the treasury space. I've been doing this for probably about 40 plus years, with the same firm.
Nice. Yeah, I've watched and seen you grow and your practice grow. I'm not an expert on recruiting by any stretch. Please bear with me on this question. I see it as that there appears to be 4 recruiting methods. I'm sure you'll be more refined. This is the retained search, contingency, internal, internet sites. Maybe there's more as well. But how do you explain the recruiting methods, and where do you see each of them making the most sense? Is there room for all of them? What makes the most sense?
Well, the 2 primary ones on a historic basis are retained search and contingency recruiting. So retained search is for more senior level roles, C-suites and the direct reports, perhaps, treasurer, sometimes assistant treasurer, or directors, depending upon the size of the organization. And in that environment, you're paying money up front. There's a significantly greater relationship with the organization, so the retained recruiter has a better understanding of the organization, how it works, who it is, the types of people, the culture, the fit, things of that nature. Contingency is is for the lower level roles, generally probably 150,000 and below, maybe even 175 or so. Those are people that receive a fee contingent to somebody being hired. So as an assistant treasurer, or somebody like that, if you're looking to hire a manager, you might have 2 or 3 or 4 firms working on it on a concurrent basis. And so those organizations are really going to be focused more on speed and getting a body in the door than on the cultural fit. A lot of firms today, many firms have their own internal recruiters, people who are and they can either be contract or they can be employees, but people who are essentially working for the organization doing the recruiting. And it's the same type of stuff that is done by the contingency recruiters. Most companies today post jobs on their website. The important takeaway here is that as many as 80% of the searches are being filled through networking.
Well, these 2 traditional methods and then a couple of the other ones, still 80% is related. networking. I know we have a lot to talk about networking. What's the strength? Would you see the strength of the web approach? Using websites for recruiting. Where does that make sense?
When I'm talking to candidates that are looking for opportunities, and I try and help them to understand what they need to do. When you see a position posted on LinkedIn or something along those lines, or an internal website perhaps, you're almost better off trying to find somebody that you can connect with at the organization, who you're already connected to, or who people that you know are connected to, in order to get your resume on the person's desk. Because it's next to impossible sometimes to get through that abyss. And so when you see a job posting, if you can figure out who the company is, you want to try and see if you can get in through what I'll suggest is, a side door. Not talking about college side doors. I'm talking about reaching out to somebody who you might know, or somebody who you know of, and seeing if they can help you understand who to be talking with.
That makes a lot of sense, Alan. I think we have certain positions that we will use websites because we're looking for 3 core skill sets, and we can get 200 applications, and then they have to pass certain tests. It gets filtered down. Then we're able to talk to 3 or 4. But oftentimes we'll hire people that have come in through the side door as well. But when nobody can filter 100 resumes, right? It's too much. So how do you filter it, and how do you filter it at different levels?
Well, if you talk to the Google recruiters, they spend 12 seconds on a resume. That's like, what? 12 seconds. I'll look at a resume and it'll take me under a minute, because I think that in many cases, we are focused on what I'll call the hidden market, which are people who are not actively looking for roles, but are smart enough to understand that when somebody calls, they should at least listen. The person, and when someone says, well, I'm happy, so, I don't need to listen to you. That person just basically told me how their lack of understanding of process. Because when someone says to me, I'm happy, my standard response is, hey, that's really good. I'm more interested today now than I was before. Because it's a very simple equation. If you're happy, you're being taken care of. You're being taken care of by your organization for one simple reason. You're doing a great job. And then I say to somebody, have you ever thought that somebody else might be able to make you happier? See, not every job is filled by somebody who is looking for a job. I recently completed a search where an individual was, she is a high potential employee at her organization. She was the chief of staff to the CFO, which was a job that she was already employed at the company and high potential, and she was offered the job and she turned it down. And then the powers that be within the organization said, we need to have a conversation because you need to take this job. And 2 years later, it's been a great job. She's learned tremendous things. It's been a wonderful grounding experience for her and a rounding out experience for her. And she was not looking for a job. But I found her. We talked about some other things that triggered thought processes. Because a lot of our recruiting is done, on a DEI basis, where many clients are looking for people of diversity. The events of the last year have highlighted that tremendously, and ESG has also highlighted that type of environment and why people are being hired. So there's a certain amount of focus on that as well. But when you start looking at websites and going back to you don't know where the resume is going. I just think of it as a deep dark abyss, and if you get out, you're lucky.
I like it, the deep dark abyss. So this environment of work from home, COVID, a focus on ESG, diversity and inclusion, other ones. What other changes are having an impact on recruiting and skill sets? Beyond some of the ones you just mentioned. What else is happening?
Well, the interesting thing is that it has made interviewing somewhat easier from a logistics perspective. Going back to this scenario I just explained, the candidate worked out of Chicago, but because their Chicago office wasn't open, she went back home to California. The job is in a third state. She never left her office at home in California to interview. She literally has not met face-to-face, handshake to handshake, her boss, the CEO of the organization, or anybody on the executive team. But from a logistics perspective, it was just setting up a phone call, setting up a Zoom meeting. The difficulties with that come from figuring out how to evaluate an individual in a scenario where it's, you're not one-on-one. I've always thought of interviewing as if it's a 2-act play. The first act is for you to convince the hiring people that you're the person they should be hiring, and that's by answering their questions effectively and efficiently. But the second act is for you to gather enough information to make the determination of whether or not you want to be there. And so it goes back and forth. But the downside is you now have to make decisions not based upon body language and things like that. So it becomes a little bit more difficult. Interviewing, and in candor, most financial executives know nothing about marketing. And as a candidate, it's an exercise in marketing. Looking for jobs is an exercise in marketing. And when you're starting to hire people, you need to be able to figure out how to evaluate them better. And some of the HR people are really good interviewers. And some of them are absolutely terrible. Conversely, some of the HR people are facilitators. They're there to make this happen, as opposed to some of them people in talent acquisition being gatekeepers. The gate's closed. You need to convince me why I should open it and let you in.
When they're paid to keep the gate closed. This idea of interviewing people remotely, I would assume you're using video. I think I remember when you were a recruiter and talked to me, I had to go someplace and we did some video way back when it was hard to do. Now it's everyone has a camera and can at least see face to face.
Right. You're talking about the last century, right?
It was this century.
No, it was in the 1990s.
It was 2000.
Oh, geez. Over a year, right?
Yeah, or is that
Yes.
the last century? Is that the last year of the other century or the first one? I guess that would be the last century.
That's a good question.
Thank you for bringing up the painful aspect of that.
The interesting thing is, in those days, you had to go to a FedEx or something like that. And we'd been doing it since the middle 90s when a client of ours says, listen, we want you to try this because we think it'll save you time and money, and it'll save us money because as a retained firm, we generally will bill our clients for our expenses. And in the 90s, you'd get on a plane. I think I belonged to like 3 different airline clubs, and you'd rent a room in the airline club if you just were flying through, and you'd interview 2 or 3 people, or you'd go to a specific location, you interview 5 or 6 or whatever. Now you can't even get into the airline clubs without a ticket. So that doesn't work any longer. And so it was also time and money. And the client said, so let's try this. So we did, and the initials were, the initial videos were like almost like watching from the mirrored disco ball, where the body movements were disconnected because the bandwidth wasn't there.
That was definitely the last century disco. That was
right.
80s or something? 70s? Who knows?
That's before my time.
In fact, I'm gonna check that one out. I got our fact checkers on that. But this idea of this work from home not impacts recruiting, but shifting from the recruiting side more towards skill sets and managing teams in this remote environment. What are you seeing happening in this, now we're more than a year on in this extended work from home or hybrid model. What are you seeing going on here, Alan?
The interesting thing is people are making more appointments via email to set up a phone call, as opposed to just reach out and make a phone call. Part of it has to do with, I think, the cell phone mentality. It's easy to call an office, but now I'm calling somebody's cell phone. I don't want to disturb them. I don't know where they are. So people are setting up calls, literally, to do that. And people are working longer hours. So I live in a bedroom suburb of New York. I'm 17 miles due east of Manhattan, but it takes me an hour and 15, an hour and 20 minutes to get to work, door to door. So I just saved myself 2.5 hours a day. But last night, after dinner, I walked into my office and I sent out about 10 or 12 emails that I never got a chance to send out during the day, that I might not have done if I was still in Manhattan. I don't look at the clock anymore at the end of the day because I used to have a schedule. So the net is I'm spending more time working. Most people who are working in a hybrid environment, WFH, as people say, working from home, are spending more time doing this. The other issue is I sit in my chair, and probably 8 o'clock, I get up for lunch, which could be 1 or 2 or sometimes 3. I have lunch, I come back, and I sit down again. I'm not sure I will go outside today. Yeah, I might because I have to take out the garbage. Okay. But that's an experience that's pretty common with most people. And managers have to be difficult. The downside of working from home is there's a loss of spontaneity. There's no more whiteboarding. And while we use Teams, it becomes difficult. And, recruiting includes what's lovingly called onboarding. And now you have to onboard people from a remote location because you're remote and they're remote. You can't take them to lunch. Normally, pre-COVID, when we would have a new person start, a couple colleagues would take that person to lunch on the first day. And maybe through the course of the first week, they'd get to meet other people at lunch and stuff like that. Because it's how they got to, become inculcated with the environment. That onboarding piece is going to become more difficult. It is more difficult. Treasurers have to pay more attention to it. They have to be more sensitive to their employees. And they have to pay attention to the amount of time their people are working.
How much of that, because it's changed and they have to pay more attention to onboarding in this remote environment, is that partly because the ability to gel as a team takes longer now because you have less frequent interactions? If that's the case, how do you get past that? What are you seeing as successes for that?
Well, one of the things, and I'll use us as an example because over the last 3 years we've doubled in size and expanded dramatically. Technology has helped us. Can you imagine what would happen if this pandemic happened 5 years ago? We didn't have Zoom. We didn't have Teams. It would have been horrible. But when we onboard people now, we set up half-hour, 45-minute Zoom meetings with their peers and with people that they're going to work with, people they're going to be exposed to. Because you have to make them feel part of the team. We have several different pieces of the organization, from the managing directors to the recruiters to the researchers to the administrative staff. And they all have to work together, even if they haven't met people. So it's really critical that you have these specific, Zoom meetings to set up for onboarding. As opposed to a lunch, it's a half hour and you hang out together and you don't necessarily talk about work, but you get to know the other people. The other thing that we do, which I found very interesting, is we have what we call roundtables once every month. And that's facilitated by internal people, and it incorporates people at several different levels within at all the different levels within the organization. And you talk about non-work stuff. Like, okay, let's talk about favorite movies or something like that, just so you start to get to know people beyond just their work product. And if the treasurer of an organization or the CFO of an organization doesn't pay attention to this, the organization starts to drift a little bit. Because, culture is real critical to the success of an organization. Organizations reflect their leadership, whether it be the Treasury Department, the CFO, or the CEO. And you have to make sure that they get it, that it trickles down. Think about the DEI thought processes. If the CEO isn't on board, it's not going to happen. And a lot of people like to hire people they already know. Well, you wind up hiring mirrors.
You told us earlier to find ways you can come in the side door.
Right. 100%.
There's probably a whole room for a podcast on D&I and diversity according to certain factors that we think about, but also diversity of thought, whether it's related to amount of melanin in skin or where you grew up. There's a lot there that probably we can unpack in more detail. I also wanted to ask you about conflict resolution in this era of remote work, right? So there's hey, you got to build the team, but there's probably more opportunities for conflict or people to become disengaged. What do you have to say about that?
That's where the manager, the person who's running the business unit or the treasurer or whatever it is, has to be more sensitive. Because you're not necessarily going to see it physically, but you have to pay attention to it. The job of a manager has become more difficult in the age of COVID than at any time prior. They have to be more sensitive to their people, to know what to expect from them, and to be able to lead them that way. It's really, the emphasis is going to be on the senior people, helping the junior people navigate the difficulties.
You saying that's really interesting, because we had, our leadership team. I now have every other week I spend at least a half hour with all of the leaders, formally scheduled to do those things. Well, we never did that. We'd have meetings and stuff, but there was a lot more opportunities for free-form meetings for the one-on-ones that, would be more occasional. And we got more formal because we were more remote. And you saying that was okay, that makes sense.
Well, thank you. But I think that and listen, you're an entrepreneur. You're running your own business. So your thought process is the one that leads the business. But you can only do so many things. And as your business grows, and God bless, you've been growing very nicely and very well, you have to rely on other people. But you have to be able to read them to know where their mindset is. And, I've always found that you're, fairly astute at understanding what motivates individuals.
Yeah. Now, thanks for those nice words, but I want to shift our conversation to a speed round. I want to tap Alan's mind. Really, the theme is: what makes for successful recruiter relationships or successful career moves. I'm going to say a word or a phrase, and you've got about 30 seconds to respond. and then we'll move on to the next one. And so I'll say something, and you give me it doesn't have to be stream of thought, but just
unvarnished, huh?
Unvarnished. But remember, this is a family show, so we'll continue. So we'll move on to the next one. Are you ready?
Yes.
Okay. You already covered the first. The first one's a softball because you essentially said it. I don't need a recruiter. I'm happy with my job.
Dumb.
You can say more than one word, too.
Okay. Fool. It's kind of like, and I'm in New York, so the phrase with the lottery is, if you're not in it, you can't win it. If you're not participating and you're not listening to what's going on outside, and you're just focused internally, and I'm happy, and I'm so on and so forth, you're going to limit your upside. I mean, don't get me wrong. It doesn't cost you anything to listen to somebody. We're not asking you to commit, a felony of some sort. We're asking you to listen. And I've always felt that if you can't listen, you're not going to hear everything.
Good point. Okay, number 2, ghosting as a strategy, or just ghosting.
I don't see the benefit of it. I call somebody, or I, link into somebody, and they respond, and then they disappear. What's the sense of that? I mean, again, it's just like, not listening. What's the purpose of ghosting? Whether it be a recruiter or a company, or, by the way, it's not just recruiters who have the experience with that in terms of, external recruiter search consultants. I run a group, the chair of the talent acquisition strategic interest group for New York City SHRM, Society of Human Resources. And it's comprised of, forgive it because this is what they call it, corporate recruiters and professional recruiters. Not that corporate recruiters aren't professional, but the distinction is, you earn your compensation that way. And the corporate recruiters have the same issue. Candidate says, yes, I want to do this, and so on and so forth, and then just disappears and doesn't respond. Where's the sense of that?
So the third one is, how do I build a relationship with a recruiter?
Treat them like you'll want to be treated yourself. We're people too. We're not just, trying to sell flesh. We're building relationships with people. And it gives you the opportunity, by talking with recruiters, it will give you the opportunity to see how they think and what are the issues that are important to them and how they align with your issues. And do you feel comfortable with these people? Sometimes you're going to sit there, you're negotiating, significant compensation. And do you trust this person? Well, how are you going to find out if you trust them? You got to talk to them. And the other side of it, the other plus of it is, the more frequently you talk to somebody, the bigger their memory spot is in your brain, and the more often. I can't tell you how many times someone has called me and I said, hey, wait a minute, I got a question. Do you do this, this, and this? Yeah. I said, let's talk about it, because now here's an opportunity that I hadn't thought about you for. And by reaching out occasionally and saying hello, you're building a relationship. It's interviewing is like dating, as is working with recruiters. You gotta, if you give somebody monosyllabic answers, you're just telling us, yeah, I'm not interested.
Mm-hmm. All right. So here's one. You're somebody in Treasury, and you get the response. Post your response on the website.
I don't understand.
Submit your resume on the website.
Right. A lot of companies use resume readers that look for words. That's the last alternative, in my opinion. unless you utilize that only if you can't figure out where the side door is or how to get in the side door.
All right, this is one for you. As here's what maybe a corporate treasurer or CFO says. Alan, we have internal recruiters. We have corporate recruiters.
Well, chances are, if they're going to say that, they're not going to say it. You're never going to hear from them. And I'm going to suggest, and I'll just touch on networking a little bit. It's all about you have to drop a name. And the CEO generally has 3 lists sitting on the CEO, CFO, CCO person. Their assistant has 3 lists sitting on their desk. If these people call me on list A, you find me, you get me, I'm going to talk to them. If the people on list B call me, tell them I want to talk to them, get their number, I'll call them back, promise. But I'm busy right now. The 3rd list, I'm busy, I will call them at some point, but I can't tell you how soon it's going to be. If you can network to that individual with somebody on list A or list B, you're going to get a call back. Because the idea of networking is to build a bridge between who you want to talk to and you, that you both can walk over at the same time. It's commonalities.
Alan, I wanted to end this particular podcast with your final thoughts on placement success or building team success. What are your final summary thoughts?
Well, diversity of your staff is really important. And McKinsey's done a number of studies that show how much more successful organizations are when they're hiring individuals that are different than them. To me, DEI, the simplest explanation is, imagine there's a painting. 3 people are looking at it. One doesn't see red, one doesn't see green, one doesn't see blue. Individually, they don't get the whole picture. As a team, they do. And it's been proven time and time again that organizations that are managed, that have a greater equivalency in the diversity space, are more profitable and are more sensitive and have a better understanding and can develop a better strategy to effectively run the business.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Alan.
Craig, it's been my pleasure.
You've reached the end of another episode of the Treasury Update Podcast. Be sure to follow Strategic Treasurer on LinkedIn. Just search for Strategic Treasurer. This podcast is provided for informational purposes only, and statements made by Strategic Treasurer LLC on this podcast are not intended as legal, business, consulting, or tax advice. For more information, visit and bookmark strategictreasurer.com.